The main reason the United Kingdom voted the way that it did is you have, by stealth, by deception, without ever telling the truth to the British or the rest of the peoples of Europe, you have imposed upon them a political union. Isn't it funny? You know, when I came here 17 years ago and I said that I wanted to lead a campaign to get Britain to leave the European Union, you all laughed at me. Well, I have to say, you're not laughing now, are you?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brexit special of the Commoners podcast. We weren't expecting to do the special this week, but Article 50 was triggered, so we thought it would be appropriate to discuss it this week. But first, Adam, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing not bad. Been a busy week. Been quite an exhausting week. I'm on my second doppio espresso of the day, so I'm feeling quite caffeinated at the moment. But it's been essentially a week of trying to figure out how to move to Barcelona, kind of preparing for a move in the summer.
The logistics of moving somewhere without being able to visit the apartment that you're going to be renting must be nerve-wracking. For me personally, I like to see the places that I live in before I actually put money down on it.
Well, there's a lot of things like that are kind of uncertain, but we're going through a reputable program, so I'm not too worried about it. But we're certainly looking forward to moving to the European Union.
Right, and you are moving to the European Union at a very interesting time because you'll be there during the negotiations for Brexit.
Which is actually quite fortunate because we're still going to be European citizens during negotiation. But we do know when the UK will no longer be part of the EU. So we'll be hopefully in and out of Spain before we're no longer allowed to be there.
Up until now, all of our talk about Brexit has been sort of about the political fallout and the politics actually inside the UK. But this week, Theresa May officially triggered Article 50 by sending the letter to the European Union notifying them of the UK's intention to leave the EU. So now we have a timeline. It's going to happen? The drop-dead Brexit day is March 29th, 2019?
That's right. It's exactly 2 years from when the letter was submitted, and that was Wednesday of this week.
That's right. But I think before we go diving deeper into what Article 50 is and the negotiation process, how did we get here? The referendum happened last June, but what led up to the referendum? Why did it actually happen in the first place?
Yeah, really, it's the story of one party, the United Kingdom Independence Party, known as UKIP, under Nigel Farage, who seems to make the rounds on American television nowadays. But if we go back a few elections, UKIP have slowly been building up support, both in the number of seats that they've been able to win in the European Parliament in particular, and in the percentage of the votes during general elections here in the UK. Now, the UKIP are a single-issue party. Their only issue is the United Kingdom's membership of the European Union. Obviously, they want to take the United Kingdom out of the EU. As they are gaining support, they're beginning to put pressure on the Conservatives that are essentially split on the issue. There's a pro-EU wing and there's a very Eurosceptic wing as well. So UKIP's growth were pulling votes away from the Conservatives. In the UK, we have a first-past-the-post system, which essentially means that every constituency is its own little election, and whoever gets the most votes in those seats, that's the party that wins the constituency and wins the seat in Parliament. Now, the problem is that where UKIP were beginning to pull votes away from the Conservatives, Labour, the centre-left-wing party in British politics, were able to overtake, or were threatening to overtake the Conservatives in some seats that they shouldn't have been able to do. So, David Cameron, being a pro-EU Prime Minister, decided to take a gamble, and he promised in his manifesto for the 2015 election that the UK would hold a referendum on its membership of the EU.
Which backfired big time.
No, this completely backfired, obviously, because he was a very pro-EU Prime Minister. But his party weren't expected to win a majority. The coalition that had been in government from 2010 between the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, they were supposed to be returned to office. That was the expectation. But the Conservatives won a majority government. They won more than half the seats in the Parliament, were able to form a government by themselves. And so David Cameron has had to stick to his promise. So the pro-EU Prime Minister put it up to a vote and it failed badly. Like you said, it backfired. And the United Kingdom decided to vote to leave 52 to 48.
What was the indication before the referendum? I mean, it seems such a risky thing to do. Were there indications that a Brexit referendum would come back with an affirmative vote to leave?
So obviously it's kind of the same problem as the Trump election recently, in which you have polling data that doesn't really seem to substantiate the progressive side, let's call it, so either the Remain vote or the Clinton side in the administration. But when you look into the details, actually you do see key indicators that could have shown success for
iceberg dead ahead.
Well, exactly. So, for instance, you look back at the 2014 European election, it was UKIP that won the most seats in the EU Parliament, or the most seats of Britain's seats in the EU Parliament. They managed to win over a quarter of the vote in that election as well. So that there were little signs saying that there were enough. There were little things that were irking people, but the common consensus, the popular consensus, was there's no chance that when it came down to the vote, that British people would actually elect to leave this biggest single market in the world. But they did.
One of the funniest things to me is that Nigel Farage was actually an MEP, a member of the European Parliament. And essentially he just went there and said, the only reason I'm here is because I want to leave the EU.
That is UKIP's single strategy, or at least it was before they get their chance at the referendum, was essentially to bring down the EU from the inside. Nigel Farage is still an MEP. He's still there. He still gets a salary from the European Union in euros. Like, he's still raking in a salary and benefits.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite parts of Brexit was watching the speech that Nigel Farage gave to the European Parliament directly after the vote. And he was essentially like, when I came here, however many years ago, you were laughing at me. Look who's laughing now.
That's a brilliant, brilliant line, because really, and I mentioned it in Political Animals, UKIP are the most successful political party of the century in British politics. They have, in fact, they no longer have even their MP, their one MP. He resigned from the party just last week. They hold only one council. They have a smattering of councillors elsewhere. So electorally, they're not actually that successful, but their key aim, their key goal, they want it. Their success is defined by Brexit.
They have had a very disproportionate influence on the direction of the country.
Yes, very much so. They pulled the country out towards the right, even given that they were only getting, I think it was around 13% of the vote or so. Much
like the Party for Animals in the Netherlands. Just putting that in there because I like them. So I thought it was interesting that up until 2009, I think it is, there was actually no formal way to leave the EU, with Article 50 being in the Lisbon Treaty, or the Treaty of Lisbon, essentially laying out in only 5 paragraphs the steps that need to be taken to leave the EU. And no nation state has actually left the EU other than, well, it's a different circumstance, but Greenland did leave. But this is sort of uncharted waters. Like, nobody seems to really know exactly what's going to happen. What is Article 50? What does it say? And what can we glean from the article itself as to what's going to happen over the next 2 years?
Sure. Prior to 2007, the European Union looked more like just the single market. With the Treaty of Lisbon, you got everything that kind of defines the European Union just now, so kind of that closer political integration as well, which essentially is what Brexit was about. Most people, I would think, weren't necessarily against the single market, but more against the political integration, or at least that was one of the larger themes during the Brexit campaign. Anyway, part of the Treaty of Lisbon was this Article 50, and you're right, it's not been used by any country. Greenland left before the Treaty of Lisbon was initiated. So Article 50 is essentially a nod to the possibility of a member state deciding to leave. It was written, though, many suspect that in a way that didn't expect any member state to want to leave. So it's actually very vague. It doesn't necessarily cover in explicit detail the way in which a member should leave. It just has little kind of nods to things. In fact, we can read through it just now. It's so short. There's only 5 points to it. And because we like kind of the nitpicking technical details here on the Commoners podcast, I'll kind of take you through it just to kind of show where the 2-year negotiation period comes from, where Britain's negotiation stance might start from, and the EU's in that case as well. So, 5 points. Number 1. Any member state may decide to withdraw from the Union in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. That's a fairly easy one. Essentially, the country gets to decide how it wants to leave. The United Kingdom, not being a country with a constitution, decided that a referendum was the way that we were going to decide this, and so we held a referendum. Kind of end off. Number 2. A member state which decides to withdraw shall notify the European Council of its intention. That's the Article 50 letter that they received on Wednesday. In the light of the guidelines provided by the European Council, the Union shall negotiate and conclude an agreement with that state setting out the arrangements for its withdrawal, taking account of the framework for its future relationship with the Union. Now, the important thing to note in there is that it's actually the EU that gets to set out the guidelines for the negotiation. The member state is kind of subject to those guidelines.
So essentially the UK is going to be shut off from having any say towards what the final agreement's going to be.
This is more about how the negotiations are going to go about. So this is the European Council, which is the body of all the heads of state of each member working together in one body. They're the ones that decide how the negotiations will go ahead. The negotiations themselves, though, will be kind of 50-50 work between the two partners, the EU on one side and the UK on the other, but it will be the EU that gets to decide how those negotiations go forward.
Okay, that makes more sense. So continuing on point 2.
That agreement shall be negotiated in accordance with Article 218.3 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. It shall be concluded on behalf of the Union by the Council, acting by a qualified majority after obtaining the consent of the European Parliament. So this is how a deal is passed. One, again, it's going to be the European Council that's in charge of negotiations for the EU, which again is all the heads of government of each member state. Acting by a qualified majority, in this case it's 72, I believe it's 72% of all the countries, and those 20 countries also need to represent 65% of the total European population. Finally, after it's passed by that qualified majority, it also needs to be passed and ratified by the European Parliament, which has perhaps been a little bit more feisty in its communication with the UK.
So the European Parliament, does it have to be 100%?
It'll probably be a majority, so just a straight 50% plus one, like any other piece of legislation. I don't even think it's a supermajority. Point 3. The treaty shall cease to apply to the state in question from the date of entry into force of the withdrawal agreement, or failing that, 2 years after notification referred to in paragraph 2, unless the European Council, in agreement with the member state concerned, unanimously decides to extend this period. So this is where the 2-year negotiation period comes from.
Researching this and looking at the sheer volume of things that need to be negotiated and figured out, and the minute details that are going to have to be hammered out in this agreement process, it seems like it's impossible. It's going to be impossible for this to be concluded in 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to be talking about thousands of policies, multiple cross-country, cross-border commissions and committees and partnerships. Like, everything has to be negotiated, renegotiated. Britain's going to have to figure out what it wants to be a part of, what it doesn't want to be a part of. And the idea of that happening in 2 years does seem a little bit fanciful. But the 2-year period in here is actually a protection for the withdrawing state. If you read some of the annotation and some of the notes from the author of Article 50, the 2-year period in there is actually to protect the state, the withdrawing state, from kind of being led along through red tape and bureaucracy and essentially being strung through all of this stuff by the European Union in perpetuity. So essentially what it says is, after you hand in the letter saying that you are leaving the EU, you have 2 years and then you leave.
So it's a protection against indefinite negotiations, essentially. The EU sort of keeping you in by not giving you an agreement.
Essentially, yes. After a state has decided to leave, it will be leaving.
And if no agreement is reached in 2 years, they revert to WTO rules.
Yep.
And then essentially they're on their own. They have to renegotiate any sorts of treaties with other countries. That seems definitely to be the worst case scenario. How would that play out, do you think?
Well, interestingly, that seems to be the government's plan B. So doomsday is plan B. Plan A is getting a good trade deal. Plan B is doomsday. So there doesn't seem to be any particular plans if a deal doesn't go through. We'll kind of get to the details of how the UK will try to avoid that particular outcome. But, there's a lot of Brexit folk that will say, actually, the UK can deal on its own, on WTO rules. Because you think about it, like you've got places like Canada, Australia, they are largely dealing on WTO rules. They're not in any larger multi-state political partnerships like the EU. So it would be fine. The question is, will it hurt the current British economy or will it improve it? And obviously you've got the Brexiteers on one side and the pro-Remainers on the other.
And I also found it interesting in her speech about Brexit a couple months ago, Theresa May essentially put all her chips on the table and said that, hey, if we don't get an agreement that we like, we're totally fine with leaving in 2 years and reverting to those rules.
Yes, the line was, no deal is better than a bad deal. So according to her, she would rather forego a trade deal that would perhaps not benefit the UK and then take the risk on the WTO basis. Essentially, these WTO rules are the basic rules that every other state functions with. It's essentially the basis on which bilateral agreements start and then work up towards trade deals. But the government's willing to take the UK to that point.
Yeah, which is definitely the hard-line stance. It seems like she's not afraid to go into these negotiations looking to get exactly what she wants.
This is essentially the hard Brexit strategy. It's playing hardball and putting everything on the line. Remember, kind of more of the hard Brexit strategy is far more based on the sovereignty argument rather than the trade argument. So there's certainly elements of the Brexit Party that will buy the sovereignty, literally putting the trade on the line.
So barring an extension, we have a drop-dead deadline of Brexit.
That's right. And the only other thing I'll add actually on point 3 is that 2-year period can be extended, but all 28 nations need to unanimously agree on that, and that is somewhat debatable. But nonetheless, number 4, for the purposes of paragraphs 2 and 3, the member of the European Council, or the council representing the withdrawing member state, shall not participate in the discussions of the European Council or in decisions concerning it. A qualified majority shall be defined in accordance with Article 238.3b of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. Essentially, all that says is the UK cannot be a voting member of the European Council during the negotiations on the subject of Brexit.
That makes perfect sense, because if you want to be leaving the EU, why are we going to have you voting in our council about how we're going to approach you leaving?
Exactly. It really is as simple as that. And finally, number 5, if a state which has withdrawn from the Union asks to rejoin, its request shall be subject to the procedure referred to in Article 49. Article 49 is how to join the European Union, which essentially means that Britain would have to walk around to the front door and get in line, like any other nation wanting to join the EU. There would be no special benefits afforded to it if it did decide in the future that it did want to rejoin.
So that's what it says. That's the technical, legal step that would need to be taken. But do you think that politically, if the UK were essentially to say, well, actually, going into these negotiations, looking at how it's going to affect us long term, we were just kidding about this whole Brexit thing. We're going to go back on this. We don't want to do Article 50 any longer. How about we just, forget this ever happened and come back in? Do you think that the EU would essentially breathe a collective sigh of relief and say, oh yeah, we'll just forget that ever happened, bring you back in? Or do you think that there would be some sort of revenge taken or punishment because they triggered it in the first place?
I mean, the European Union is a union of asterisks. There are exceptions to exceptions to exceptions to exceptions, and on and on and on down the list. So I could easily see the European Union being able to wiggle out of this particular withdrawal notice. However, it's not going to happen. Britain is not going to back out of Brexit. Yeah,
so that's Article 50. We know the vague terms of Brexit. You got to love these vague legal documents like Article 50, the U.S. Constitution, which nobody can 100% agree on what it means in most cases. But what really are the next 2 years going to look like? How do you see negotiations playing out? And what are going to be the key themes, both from the EU and the UK, in the negotiation process?
So to look back on the vagueness of Article 50, there's already been disagreement about how negotiations should go forward. The negotiations need to accomplish 2 things. 1, they need to figure out what the divorce settlement will look like, and 2, they need to figure out what the future relationship will look like. So essentially, after the divorce, they need to figure out how to chat with their ex-girlfriend and how to have a suitable social and beneficial relationship with...
Who's going to have custody of the kids and all
exactly.
that, which weekend.
And there might be alimony payments, but all that stuff needs to be figured out. And there's already been arguments about this. Britain has essentially said in its withdrawal letter that it expects to do both at the same time, to work on the divorce settlement and the future relationship. Germany and France immediately came back and said, no, that's not going to happen. Divorce first, settlement first, and then we talk about future relationship. And the problem is that Article 50 doesn't really solve the problem for them. The line that everyone is looking at for this is, in the light of the guidelines provided by the European Council, the Union shall negotiate and conclude an agreement with that state setting out arrangements for its withdrawal, i.e. the divorce, taking account of the framework of its future relationship with the Union. What on earth does taking account of? Does that mean with a nod to? Does it mean having already figured out an element of the future negotiation, the future relationship? So it just the vagueness of the article isn't helping anybody. So my prediction is that the divorce settlement will be figured out within the 2-year period. I think that the settlement will happen. I think too, and I think Germany and France have already kind of softened their language a little bit. I think they will be able to talk about their future relationship a bit, but I think that the future relationship will take a good number of years really to figure out. I'm talking maybe 3, 4, 5 years, and I think some estimates even go out as far as 10 years. So I think divorce settlement definitely within 2 years, but the larger future framework of the relationship between the two, the UK and the EU, I think that'll take upwards of 5 to 10 years.
Right, and something that complicates that even further is that there's no agreement among the 27 EU countries on basically what steps should be taken first and what the approach to the negotiations should be. So you have, Germany and France who ostensibly want the Brexit deal to be more or less hammered out before they even start looking at trade deals. And then you have other smaller nations that benefit more from Britain and the UK's economy, like Cyprus, who are saying, well, actually, we're not married to the idea that, Brexit comes first and then trade later, because it's more in their interest that trade deals are hammered out beforehand. France and Germany might not really need a trade deal as much as these smaller countries do, and they kind of want to put the screws to the UK a little bit. Because you can definitely see, I could definitely see this becoming a hot button issue, because if you're going to negotiate Brexit first and then trade details, that definitely gives the EU, I think, a stronger negotiation position in the Brexit deal. Whereas if you're working on them both at the same time, that could potentially give the UK a stronger standing in the negotiations.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And what I'll highlight as well for the American, or really anyone that isn't familiar with European Union politics, is that there is no such thing as a homogenous European political philosophy, which, seems to be romantically assumed, I think, sometimes. Like all Europeans are progressive, liberal, with the same idea of how the economy should work. That's just not true. So you've got 28 currently members of the EU, one of them being about to leave, and they're all very different, with different interests, different economies, different social programs. Internally they have different political factions, different political parties, each trying to lobby the particular government at the time to get different things. So it's hardly a homogenous group. And yeah, like you said, there's definitely countries that would benefit from a hard Brexit, i.e. Germany, France, like the big economies, Luxembourg in particular, which has a huge financial hub, easily could take business away from the City of London, the UK's major financial hub. And then you've got the smaller states as well. You're talking Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Cyprus you mentioned, that really do benefit from the European Union. They get far more out of the European Union than they put in. And the UK is the country that gives the third largest amount of money into the EU. There's a lot of money that comes into the EU from the UK. So yeah, there's hardly a lot of unity one would expect.
And the UK is actually at a deficit
to
what it's giving and getting from the EU.
They currently give in £8.8 billion per year. They receive back in rebates about 4.8 billion. So they are essentially losing 50% of everything that they give into the EU, which might not look like a good investment. But what isn't taken into account in these calculations is the money that comes back into the private sector through deals through the single market, like the fact that the City of London can function as if it is in Spain or in Bulgaria or in Poland or Germany without really crossing borders, without tariffs, without any extra taxation on their business or the movement of people. That isn't taken into account. So we don't actually know what the full net gain from the European Union, or indeed net loss, is from the European Union as regards the private economy. We're going to find out. We're going to find out very soon, like within the next 10 years, when either the economy shoots up or tanks. But yeah, so in terms of public money in and public money out, the UK has one of the largest deficits at around 50%.
Yeah, and you had sent me an article that actually, it was excellent. We'll put it in the description of the episode, that essentially did a quick overview of what all the other EU 27 countries really want to get out of Brexit and what their priorities are. Now, similar to the United States, where you have a federalist system with a central government that sort of governs over the smaller governments of the states, you have net beneficiaries and you have net payers into the federal system. The net beneficiaries are generally red states. I'll just throw that in there. But you do have some states that take more and benefit more from federal government spending than others. Like, so Massachusetts doesn't really benefit from federal government spending, but states like Louisiana do. So you do have smaller economies within the EU, similar to smaller states or smaller economies in the states, that definitely benefit more from the EU than countries like Britain do. And their interests a lot of times in these negotiations is to make sure that when the UK Brexits itself, essentially that their payments that they've guaranteed that they would give to the EU, I think through till 2020 it's going to be, those are still made because they don't want to see an immediate jump in the percentage that they have to pay towards the EU, and they don't want to see an increase in taxes and all of that. So from what I can see, some of the smaller nations, one of their biggest priorities on top of citizens' rights, which we'll get to later, is really, well, we really want to make sure that the UK pays its dues because essentially we don't want to start having to pay a ton more. This
has already become a controversy in the short week since Article 50 has been officially triggered. The number that the EU has given the UK is £57 billion.
That's a lot.
Yeah, in dues and fees. I believe you're right, like leading up to 2020 commitments. Now, I think this is obviously the smaller countries, the smaller economies want to, and they already benefit from the money coming in from the UK, but they also want to ensure that still comes in. So not only are they pushing for a big bill like this, but they will also push for kind of a softer Brexit. So they'll push hard on Britain having to pay fees and dues to exit, but they'll also push quite hard for a soft Brexit, essentially allowing the UK a fair amount of access still to the free market. So talk about a big free trade deal, because they still want British money coming into the EU because they're the ones that would benefit the most from it.
And then you have larger countries like Germany and France who essentially, I think Angela Merkel even came out and was just saying the UK cannot sit there and cherry pick the good parts of the EU and also want to leave the things that they don't want, like excessive regulations and things like that. So, you can't have the single market, you can't have the customs union, and not expect to have the same in like employees' rights and regulations on corporations. It just, you can't have that.
There are 4 fundamental principles of the EU, and the 2 that are butting heads are free movement of goods and the free movement of people. And so what the negotiating philosophy of the EU has been, and particularly pushed hard by Germany, is Britain cannot have a better deal out of the EU than in the EU. That makes logical sense when you think about it. Like, there's no conceivable way that the UK should have better access to the single market without having to pay the dues, for instance, or without allowing freedom of movement of people. So that is the push that Germany wants to see.
Right, and something that I thought was really interesting and slightly ironic is that so much was put on sovereignty leaving the EU, when if the UK wants to join the single market after Brexiting, they're going to have to essentially follow the same regulations they're following right now. Isn't that correct?
Well, actually, yeah. So it's not even necessarily about joining the free market. It's just any trade deal with the EU will require them to maintain the same regulations as the EU currently has. That's the same essentially with any trade deal. You look at TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The TPP would have had regulations on dairy across all the signatories to the TPP, which meant that New Zealand would have lost some sovereignty over its dairy regulations, or at least that exported out to the rest of the TPP countries. So in the same sense, Britain, while technically having quote-unquote sovereignty over its regulations, anything that is exported to the EU will still have to fit the regulations that is currently mandated by the EU. And it's because of that I find the sovereignty folk completely blind to the irony, because no matter what trade deal you have, and these people are for, bilateral trade deals with countries that we couldn't have dealt with while being part of the EU, but those trade deals will include limitations on your sovereignty. It will include regulations, and I just find that very, very funny.
Just as a quick aside, something else I was reading about was that the EU is under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, but it is not exclusively under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. One of the most controversial instances of the UK having its sovereignty essentially overridden was this guy named Abu Qatada, who was a terrorism suspect, and the European Court of Human Rights ruled literally that the UK could not deport him to Lebanon, which caused all manner of controversy, because you're essentially an outside independent court is telling a nation state that, yeah, no, I know that guy is a terrorism suspect and you've been watching him for years, but no, you can't legally deport him from your country. But as much as that hurts the sovereignty folk and they rail against things like that, they're not leaving that behind by leaving the EU. They're really only leaving the European Court of Justice. I think that Russia and the Ukraine are even part of the European Court of Human Rights.
Yeah, that's right. The European Court of Justice is the judicial branch of the EU. And really all it is an appeals court for problems arising between two states within the EU. It's completely separate from the European Court of Human Rights, which, as you said, has signatories outside of the European Union. Brexit that's about to happen necessitates that Britain will leave the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, because why would it have to appeal to a court that doesn't have any oversight over its function? Whereas the UK still being a signatory to the European Court of Human Rights, it won't actually undo any of the controversy that's happened in the past. Now, the reason why Abu Qatada wasn't deported was because his safety couldn't be guaranteed upon his return. So he managed to keep his case in the European Court of Human Rights, and they kept finding in his favour. Coming out of the European Union doesn't solve that sovereignty issue. Similar to free trade deals, any trade deal, there are regulations. Even thinking like the Geneva Convention, for instance. Like the UK is a signatory to the Geneva Convention. It has freely given up some of its sovereign rights to do as it wishes. So again, kind of this concept of sovereignty is... It's kind of a shadow argument. It really isn't there. It doesn't have much substance. It's just a patriotic word that we can throw out and gain support. But really, when it comes down to it, like countries all over the world, including the United States, give up their sovereignty on certain issues every day for every trade deal, for every international negotiation. It's really coming down to political rhetoric.
It's just it's a case, I think, of voters not following campaign promises to their logical conclusions. Like we saw here in the United States, for instance. I mean, I'm sure from what I gather, sovereignty was a huge talking point for the people who were advocating a leave vote.
For one of the campaigns to leave the EU, there were two of them. One of them was a sovereignty campaign, yes.
You have analogous things happening in the United States where Trump runs on these anti-corruption, populist rhetoric, healthcare, we're going to have the best insurance ever for everybody. Everybody's going to be insured. And then they get into power and then we find out, actually, he was blowing smoke up your ass the whole time. You see you see that all the time where people are voting for something, but they haven't necessarily thought through exactly how it's going to play out if what they're voting for actually happens. I just thought that was a particularly brutal irony of this whole situation, is that people aren't going to get what they voted for, and they could potentially be in a much worse spot.
Yes, the irony will continue, and Britain will still find itself on the side of being regulated by both foreign courts and by trade deals that it strikes in the future as well. That's what we voted for.
So over the last 2 or 3 days, after we decided to do this Brexit episode, I've been slogging through over 100 pages worth of articles, just trying to get a handle on what the major themes are and what the major things are that need to be negotiated over the next 2 years. Just reading this, again, I think it's just going to be impossible for all of these issues to have resolution in a 2-year time period. Could you sort of go into detail on the overarching biggest issues that need to be settled, and then maybe we can get into the particulars of the most important issue?
The UK and the EU need to undo about 40 years of treaties and deals, again, covering thousands of policy issues and, like I said, committees and commissions and partnerships, all that good stuff. So here's kind of a list of kind of random things that need to be negotiated, just to kind of give you an idea of what's going on. So you've got EU citizens' rights in the UK and UK citizens' rights in the EU. You've got issues on how to deal with refugees. You've got the Gibraltar issue. We need to work out a new trade deal. There's security and intelligence sharing. The EU warrant programme, air passengers' rights, recognition of academic qualifications, the UK border in French soil at Calais. You've got the importation of pig semen, healthcare, response to pandemics, military cooperation, disease prevention, medication licensing, the Irish border, and many, 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 many more. Some obviously more important than others.
I guess my question is, out of that whole list, what tops the bill? What's the most important for everyone involved?
The three big ones are probably trade, security, and borders. Trade is obviously the big one. That's kind of the big issue on everyone's mind. That's obviously where the money is. So everyone is thinking about business and the effect on the economies, both on the European and the UK side as well. So just to give you a few details on this, Britain's ideal outcome is a big free trade agreement. 43% of the export market from the UK goes to the EU, and 53% of all of our imports comes from the EU. So obviously the EU is our biggest trading partner. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research predicts that there may be a long-term reduction, probably between 22% and 30% in trade, no matter what that outcome is going to be. So the British economy is going to be hit fairly hard. It's going to lose close to, it looks like about a 10% chunk of its economy. So it needs to be able to make up for that deficit somewhere else. Now, obviously, the idea is creating bilateral trade agreements with other countries. Trump, for instance, has been quite supportive of the idea of a bilateral agreement between the US and the UK, so maybe that is enough to actually make up for the deficit. The pros of Brexit, though, for the UK is that it does actually get to decide now who it trades with, being part of the EU single market. It was the EU that did that on behalf of the UK. Again, kind of getting back to the sovereignty issue. This might actually be a decent point for the sovereignty issue. So now the UK can trade individually with the US, with India, with China, with Africa, or the African states. The con, though, is that the UK is leaving the biggest single market, which rivals the US and is bigger than China. So there is a risk that, the UK pulling out of this market, suddenly the UK isn't competing with the US and China anymore, it's competing with Canada and Brazil and Argentina.
God forbid you end up like Canada.
Oh, no.
Though Canada does have a trade agreement with the EU.
So yes, you're right, if the UK was to find itself outside of the single market in a position, say, like Canada, it could still do big free trade agreements with the EU. Canada has one itself. CETA was signed just late last year or earlier this year. That's the Canadian-European Trade Agreement. And essentially that was a big free trade agreement between Canada and the EU. So the UK could potentially have some type of an agreement with the EU, like the one that Canada has, but it's more a question of clout, and the UK just won't have a lot of clout with major economies in the same way that Canada. Like, no one fears Canadian economic power. No one fears Canadian economic influence. They fear the European Union's economic influence. They fear China's. They fear the United States. But no one is scared of Canada pulling business out of a foreign economy.
So then how the trade deals are going to work out and the long-term effects are still going to be a big question mark then?
Yeah, but ultimately it will come down to how gracious each side is with the other. It's difficult to say exactly how things will be influenced, especially when money is involved. So could I see the EU being somewhat fair to the UK to maintain some of the UK's economic influence? Yes. Could I see the UK essentially shutting down negotiation talks because they want to maintain sovereignty? Yes. It's very, very difficult to figure out at the moment, especially when there are so many other kind of world factors that, might change over the next couple of years. So, like I said, the UK will probably want a big free trade deal with the EU. The EU will probably be relatively open to it so long as the deal doesn't actually look better than membership itself.
What do you think the chances are of the EU being punitive in its deal with the UK? Or do you think that the integrity of the EU itself is going to be the most important issue for these negotiations?
It's a good question, isn't it? Because there is a risk that the European Union decides to play the punitive card, essentially to make sure that no other member of the EU wants to leave the EU. At the same time, I do see the EU having a united front in negotiations so far. My assumption is that given the power that Russia seems to be aggressively showing out in the European Union's east, and from relative ambivalence and apathy from the American government, the Trump administration in the West, I think that European Union solidarity will be the major player that will focus European Union negotiations. So I think the EU27, the remaining EU members, will put the European Union first before anything else, even if that means punishing the United Kingdom for leaving. I think it will maintain and it will strive to maintain solidarity.
You mentioned Russia there, which is sort of a good segue into the next really important point of negotiations, which would be security and defense. How big of a player is the UK in the security and defense of the EU, and how important is that going to be in negotiations?
The UK plays a fairly significant role. The UK is one of the two nuclear powers in the EU, the other one being France. And it is one of the Five Eyes, the big international intelligence sharing organisation between the US, Canada, the UK, New Zealand and Australia. Now, some of that intelligence will also make its way into the EU, especially considering that the UK has a lot of shared interests with the EU. So security and defence is kind of a big one, but Theresa May has been playing a bit of a hard line on it, and this actually comes from the letter that she sent last Wednesday that triggered Article 50. The letter itself actually mentioned security 11 times, and actually only mentioned the economy, I think, about 7 times, trade about 7 times. So you might be able to tell what's on Theresa May's mind, but it actually stirred up a bit of controversy because the language of the letter seemed to almost contain veiled threats that the UK might withhold its security cooperation if economic deals and negotiations didn't come through in the UK's favour. So let me read something, a couple paragraphs from the letter. The United Kingdom wants to agree with the European Union a deep and special partnership that takes in both economic and security cooperation. To achieve this, we believe it is necessary to agree the terms of our future partnership alongside those of our withdrawal from the EU. So what Theresa May is actually saying here is kind of getting back to that argument we were chatting about earlier on, the divorce proceedings versus the future relationship. Essentially, the UK line is, no, we do both. And we do both at the same time. And what the veiled threat seems to be in this part of the letter is, well, we might actually withhold a bit of security cooperation if that doesn't go ahead. Here's another little paragraph as well. If, however, we leave the European Union without an agreement, the default position is that we would have a trade that we would have trade on World Trade Organization terms. In security terms, a failure to reach agreement would mean our cooperation in the fight against crime and terrorism would be weakened. In this kind of scenario, both the United Kingdom and the European Union would of course cope with the change, but it is not the outcome that either side should seek. We must therefore work hard to avoid that outcome. So again, in this paragraph, Theresa May is pushing, no, we really should be pushing this economic agreement because, by the way, we might find ourselves in a position where we can't help you in security. So it just seems a little bit too much of a veiled threat. So it actually kind of stirred up a bit of controversy this week.
Yeah, nice single market you got there. It'd be a shame if something were to happen to it, you know?
Well, in a sense, it's very much withholding security for economic gain, and it just feels uncomfortable. Now, the international realist side of me would actually say that, okay, fine, yeah, actually that's not a bad play by the United Kingdom, but especially when you're dealing with quote-unquote friends, it just seems a little shady.
Theresa May is a fairly popular politician in the UK, correct?
Yes. Polling, if an election essentially was held tomorrow, the Conservatives would be voted back in with a majority, not just a majority, but a huge majority. I think the last seat count I saw was over 400 seats, or close to 400 seats in a 600-seat parliament. With the rest of the parties kind of dwindling around the 50 to 150 mark. So she would be voted in quite handily. She kind of ran her leadership campaign for the Conservative leadership as a safe pair of hands, and she's kind of come across as that. She's proved her mettle in being a secure and stable pair of hands. And with kind of language like this, she really plays to the side of the country that, you know, wants Britain to play hardball on the international stage, to kind of reinstitute kind of old imperial Britain that really did rule the seas. And it just works well, so a lot of people back her for it.
That's what I was going to say, because you can sort of see why she would be popular with language like that. She's definitely trying to put herself in the strongest negotiation position possible. At the same time, she's not afraid to put it all on the table to get what's best for her country. So, you know, even though the rhetoric is maybe a little irresponsible, especially in the day and age that we live in with the threat of terrorism and attacks like that, and the obvious threat of Russia as well, but you can see how that would sort of play towards the people who really want more sovereignty and are, you know, big fans of the UK.
The language itself isn't necessarily nationalist language, but it plays towards the kind of the growing nationalist sentiment that is growing up here in the UK. It's very much a Britain first, or a powerful Britain type argument. So it plays well at home. It really does.
It plays well over here too. That sort of America first rhetoric, Britain first rhetoric. It plays well with the more right wing, more nationalistic base.
I wouldn't even call them the far right now that are specifically nationalistic. I think nationalistic sentiment is kind of coming out of the centre right as well, and even the centre in a sense. I think the Labour Party in particular is having a lot of problems because it isn't embracing, or can't embrace, kind of that patriotic nationalistic sentiment. Corbyn is an internationalist and a globalist. He doesn't necessarily, he's a Trotskyist really, so he doesn't ultimately believe in national borders. He believes more in class borders. So he struggles to put forward kind of a patriotic nationalistic line, and it is costing him quite a bit.
As is being played out in the utter collapse of the Labour Party across the UK.
Yep. He is the least popular Labour leader ever, I think, one of the polls that came out. It really, really is quite sad. But there's kind of three things that I want to consider on the security and defence front. The UK works with the European Union through three organisations, essentially, for mutual benefit and interest. The first one is the European Arrest Warrant. Essentially, that means that criminals caught in one part of the EU can be extradited easily to another part of the EU. You've also got Europol, which is an EU agency that coordinates continent-wide crime fighting and operations and exchange of intelligence. That essentially allows every country to share intelligence with each other and talk to each other about criminal and terrorist activity. And finally, you've got the second generation Schengen Information System, which is a mouthful, admittedly. But this is essentially a big alert system that allows different countries to access alerts about terrorist suspects, criminal suspects, foreign fighters, missing people, etc. So there's a few things in there that are built into the European Union. What it doesn't contain is NATO. Now, most European Union countries are also NATO members. Some aren't, Finland being the most obvious one, but most of the EU nations are also members of NATO. So all of the regulations the UK has signed up to through NATO will still apply. It means that the UK will probably still keep its forces in Poland and in the Baltic states. It means that they will still be able to work militarily with the EU, but it's more of an issue of intelligence sharing than anything else.
Well, one would hope that the support for NATO would not waver due to Brexit.
I think that the UK is very much in a position to continue supporting NATO, and any news coming out of the States that says that the US might renege on its commitments to NATO worries both the UK and the rest of the EU, no matter what is happening with Brexit.
Yeah, especially with Putin's recent forays into the Ukraine, and it definitely looks like he's trying to make power grabs outside of Russia.
And when you've got a number of former states that used to be in the Russian sphere of influence, you think the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, you think Poland, you think Romania, Bulgaria, and now having shifted their attention and allegiance to the West, to the European model of integration, that is kind of a slap in the face to Putin. And so he is very willing to see the European Union kind of fall apart a little bit. He would much rather have a Russian-dominated Eastern Europe as opposed to a Western-dominated Eastern Europe, as is currently the case, minus Belarus and Ukraine and Moldova. But yeah, nothing would make Putin happier than to see the European Union begin to crumble, because then he can start asserting his influence again.
Yeah, and hopefully that knowledge alone is enough to sort of bind together the rest of the 27 countries in these negotiations and really focus on the integrity of the EU itself post-Brexit. I
think that'll definitely be the case. And I would also argue that given that Britain was one of the biggest detractors, one of the states that would disagree most with further European integration, I think you can easily see that if Putin continues his aggressive influence pushing, you'll see further integration in the European Union that might even include a Central European military force. Currently unpopular at the moment, but you don't really know what's going to happen over the next couple of years. The UK would have been against it, would have always been against it, but you could see a combined European military force at some point in the future now.
This is sort of switching gears a little bit, but one other thing that I really thought was interesting in my research that I didn't realize was such a big issue is borders questions. I understood that there were complexities with the border in Ireland, but I didn't really understand what was going on with the border in Gibraltar and why it was such a hot button issue. Could you sort of give the context of that and why it would be really important in these negotiations, and then maybe also touch on the Irish border as well?
Sure. Gibraltar is an overseas territory of the United Kingdom, so it's a self-governing territory, but it does rely on the United Kingdom for negotiating its foreign relations, for its defence, for managing any international trade deals like the EU, for instance. The problem is that Spain for the last 300 years has laid claim to Gibraltar. It's a small peninsula that juts off of the south of Spain, so it is really far removed from the UK. But it has been distinctly British for the past 300 years and is not looking to give up that British identity. What has seemed to have happened, again, that numerous controversies seem to have exploded in the past week, but what has seemed to happen is that as the European Council has put forward the outline for its negotiations, included in that seems to be an agreement that the EU will back the Spanish position on Gibraltarian sovereignty. So essentially is backing Spain in the fight with the United Kingdom over Gibraltar. The Spanish have managed to convince the EU negotiators that in order for any deal to apply in Gibraltar, that it has to have the agreement of Spain. So what that means is that any of the economic conditions that will apply to the UK after Brexit, the Kingdom of Spain can veto those particular outcomes from applying in Gibraltar, possibly leaving Gibraltar in a very poor economic state. So for instance, if the UK gets a big free trade deal, that won't apply to Gibraltar unless Spain says so. And that is a big, big slap in the face to Britain, who has defended this territory, this little territory, for the past 300 years. That is being put forward again as an issue in Brexit negotiations when arguably it shouldn't.
Which is yet another sort of strike against the sovereignty issue that the UK is having anyway.
I think that Gibraltar might be used as a kind of a betting chip of sorts. Essentially, the EU could say, well, actually, we'll raise the bill maybe up to £60 billion and we'll drop this whole Gibraltar issue.
As an aside, while we're talking about Spain, something that I found really interesting that may actually affect you and your hopes for Scottish independence is that Spain is not keen on a special deal being made with Scotland were it to leave the UK in the wake of Brexit to enter back into the EU, because they're particularly worried about separatists in Catalonia getting an idea that they should leave Spain and then try to get back into the EU.
Interesting that you bring that one up, actually. Yes, Spain does have separatist issues like the United Kingdom. The Catalonia and Basque regions would very much like independence from Spain, in much the same way that at least half of the population in Scotland wants independence from the United Kingdom. However, just this morning, the Spanish Foreign Secretary has come out and said, no, of course we would not veto Scotland entering the EU. So admittedly, that is a big softening of the stance from the Spanish government, because for a long time they were, yes, of course we're going to veto Scotland. We don't want this whole separatist thing to work out, because obviously they were thinking of the Catalonia region. But there does seem to be a softening in that stance now. Whether that is supposed to be a punitive measure against the UK, for instance, because obviously a Scottish independence success would mean a weaker United Kingdom, that's to be debated. I'm not entirely sure what has brought about this softening of stance, but it's there now. So, yeah. So when I was writing the notes for this episode, it was still the case that Spain had very distinctly said, and this I think came from the Prime Minister a number of months ago, that Spain intended to veto anything that Scotland would do regarding the EU. But now you've got his Foreign Secretary coming out and saying, well, actually, no, we wouldn't veto Scotland entering the EU.
It might actually play out well for Scotland.
It could in the end. But Spain and the United Kingdom have had long-running disagreements regarding sovereignty. Gibraltar is obviously the big one. For sovereignty over territory to play into the EU negotiation might actually be quite underhanded, but it certainly gives a strong hand to the EU. And another interesting thing that came out this morning was one of the former Conservative Party leaders seeming to allude to a military solution to this particular problem, alluding to a former female Prime Minister, i.e. Margaret Thatcher, when she sailed across half the world to defend the Falklands against Argentina in the 1980s. So the allusion being that the UK might not be so uninterested in using military force to protect Gibraltar either. Again, a week of controversy. It's been fantastic. You get one letter and you've got so many controversies coming out in 1 week.
Could we shift gears a little bit and talk about the Irish border and how that's significant?
Yeah, the Irish border is kind of the opposite from the Gibraltarian border. Gibraltar has a hard border with Spain. There are passport checks that you need to pass through, wait in line to get through to Spain and vice versa. Ireland doesn't have a border between the Republic and Northern Ireland, and the reason for this is because of the Good Friday Agreements. The Good Friday Agreements brought an end to the violence of the Troubles that existed in the 70s and 80s, and the porous border was supposed to allow the nationalists in Northern Ireland to commune with the rest of the Republic, almost to kind of give a nod to the fact that Ireland was indeed a single culture and territory, even if there was an international border that divided Northern Ireland from the Republic of Ireland. So there have been no customs checks, there have been no passport checks. You would only know that you were crossing an international border by the lines in the road and the change in the speed limit between kilometres and miles per hour. But what Brexit threatens to bring back is customs checks, at least, which would begin to separate Northern Ireland again from the Republic, which would actually be in contravention to the peace deal that brought an end to the Troubles. So both the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom are very keen to keep that open, but the Republic of Ireland will be represented by the EU 27, all of the member states combined and not just itself. So Ireland will definitely be pushing for the continuation of the porous border between the two countries.
Yeah, so it will be really interesting to see how that plays out. So quickly, as one of my last questions, who do you think has the stronger negotiating position in the Brexit negotiations, the EU or the UK?
It's really a difficult question to answer. I would have said previously that the UK had the upper hand, but they have just been so disorganised in the run-up to the negotiations that their main position is, as we've seen, is essentially a veiled threat on security for an economic bargain. And if that doesn't happen, then a resortment to no trade deal at all and back to WTO rules. In the meantime, the European Union has been united. The Central European Council said no individual EU member can negotiate at all pre-negotiations, individually that is. And they all abided by that rule. They've all maintained their unity. And I think because of that, because the EU is so united and because the UK has kind of muddled through the past few months trying to figure out what to do, then I think the EU is in a much better position and ready to go, whereas, I don't see the UK being ready anytime soon.
My final question on this, and arguably the most important one, how does Brexit and these negotiations affect Scotland?
Obviously, it brings back our constitutional question. In 2014, we were asked, should Scotland be an independent country? The question now has to be, has enough changed, fundamentally changed, to allow for that question to be asked again? Because it seems a little bit, unscrupulous, perhaps a little bit unfair to ask the same question twice within 2 years of each other, simply because you didn't, or because it might look as if you didn't like the outcome of the first referendum. So there's that risk. But I do think that enough has changed. Leaving the EU is a major constitutional shift. Scotland, I think, is more philosophically aligned with a European political philosophy than the rest of the UK. I think England has a tendency to agree more with the conservative values that you would find in the States, whereas Scotland tends to agree more with the liberal progressive values that exist, again, more generally in Europe as a whole. It is admittedly a recent development, because back as early as as late as the 1950s, Scotland was a conservative country, like more conservative than the rest of the UK, but that really has shifted, and where England has had a tendency to return to kind of a British imperial mindset. I mean, Brexit came about because of English nationalism. It was a vote for English nationalism. Scotland tends to be more internationalist and globalist, and I think because of that, it actually has a better, or will have a better relationship with the EU. Interestingly, though, I don't know if I would necessarily agree with Scotland becoming independent and immediately rejoining the EU. I think I'd be more comfortable with the idea of them joining EFTA, which would mean being part of the single market, and it would mean freedom of movement. But I do wonder if Scotland should taste true independence first before joining another political union, especially if it does actually begin to integrate in the face of Russian aggression in the East and Trump's ambivalence in the West.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, especially with the new independence referendum that was proposed by Nicola Sturgeon. I did want to get to Trump. You mentioned him there. Just as a perspective from the United States on how the Trump administration may respond to Brexit and maybe influence things like NATO and the EU in the future.
So what we hear often here in the EU is that Trump is just anti-EU. He seems to come across as someone who, one, was very much in favour of Brexit, and two, would be very much in favour of the Netherlands leaving the EU, or France or Germany leaving the EU. In fact, the whole thing coming apart. So essentially, are we hearing correctly?
It's hard to say. As usual, it's nearly impossible to nail down Trump on any single policy position. And that's because it seems like he's switched positions more than once, even from his campaigning season to becoming president. So during the campaign, he called NATO obsolete, and that he seemed ambivalent towards maybe the United States' involvement or pulling back some of the United States' involvement in NATO. He seemed obviously ambivalent at best to the EU, and even spoke very highly of Brexit and the UK's decision to leave, and even essentially saying that he would be okay and even happy to see more countries do that. Since becoming president, maybe after sitting down with some advisors and realizing the national security interests that are at play, he's softened his rhetoric on NATO, and he's also softened his rhetoric a little bit on the EU. Maybe you could say that. Although, being Trump, he tends to say contradictory things, even in the same speech, in the same sentence itself. So he'll come out and say that he thinks the EU is wonderful and he loves the EU, but then at the same time, he'll say things like, well, Brexit's a great thing and I'm very happy to see the UK leaving. So until he makes a solid policy stance, until he actually takes action, I'm afraid we really just don't know exactly where he stands. I think a better place to look is the people that he surrounds himself with. At least in the first 100 or so days of his administration, it definitely seems like he's very easily swayed in one way or the other. For instance, prior to becoming president, during his campaign, he talked about bringing back torture big time, even more so than what we were doing before. Then enters General Mattis, who is against torture. Trump appoints him and has discussions with him, and then after those discussions, Trump comes out as against torture and saying that we're not going to bring it back. So he was swayed there. Another instance that's not as good, actually just plain out bad, he was talking about how we need to bring pharmaceutical companies to heel and hold them accountable because they're, quote, killing people. Well, then he had a meeting with heads of all these pharmaceutical companies, and magically his positions changed, and he said, well, really the issue is that it takes too long to approve these drugs, so we need to loosen the regulations on FDA approvals. So, he switches. It seems like he switches his opinion on things in a moment. So that sort of volatility is not good, obviously, with international relations. But again, I think if we look towards his advisors and their thoughts, we'll get an idea of where Trump is going to be pushed in the future. As far as NATO, Mattis is very pro-NATO. The only thing that Mattis talks about is that the funding from other countries for NATO is low. And that's pretty much objectively true. I think only 5 out of the 28 NATO countries actually give the recommended 2% of GDP. So there will be a push from the Trump administration to sort of up the financial contribution from the other members. The Secretary of State, even Rex Tillerson, essentially came out in strong support of NATO, but then also introduced the caveat of, well, as long as all these other nations are chipping in that 2% and bumping up their financial contribution. So again, sort of in the line of what Theresa May is doing in the Brexit negotiations, saying, yeah, security is great, but we need these financial guarantees first. As far as the EU, Trump's top advisor, Steve Bannon, is very much a Eurosceptic. He's very much against any sort of international organization that takes away sovereignty or absolute sovereignty from a country. So you could definitely see Trump at probably at best taking a agnostic position towards the EU, not being rabidly for it and not being overtly against it. However, we have seen in instances like the TPP, Trump withdrew the United States from the TPP, and he actually said that he'd much rather do bilateral trade agreements. So you definitely have the possibility of Trump sort of trying to exercise soft power in the EU by taking a newly Brexited UK, giving them a top-tier bilateral trade agreement that could potentially make it more attractive to other countries that would maybe consider leaving the EU, getting bilateral trade agreements directly from the United States. But that remains to be seen. Obviously, we're not going to know until Brexit's actually concluded and the United States starts trade negotiations. But Trump has come out, I think, after his meeting with Theresa May, saying that, we're right in line. We are the first in line to make a very good, as he would call it, trade deal with the UK. Best case scenario, Trump is agnostic to the EU and not an overt advocate of it. Worst case scenario, he tries to exercise soft power through trade deals to sort of lure countries out of it.
That's not encouraging. I must admit. It's especially in the face of the potential, and it could be still somewhat suggestive at the moment, we're not entirely sure where it leads yet, but the potential for essentially the unknown relationship between the Putin administration in Russia and the Trump administration in the States. We're just... It's just tough to believe that the Trump administration wants anything good for the EU. A lot of Trump's message was America first. It was make America great again. The problem is that Trump's philosophy isn't America first, it's America only.
Right.
And so it doesn't matter what the EU looks like, whether it's together or apart, it's just America only. It's like whatever is good for America at the time. And the problem is that he's the judge of that. And so that does not fill me with much encouragement.
And it shouldn't, because, like I said, he's not going to be an advocate of the EU. And if it does start to fall apart, he's not gonna try to stop it.
All right. Well, that is essentially why I would see my arguments for further European integration actually happening, assuming actually that Trump gets his second term. If you continue to have a man like Trump in charge of the foreign policy of the most powerful country in the world, I guarantee you that you'll see further European integration.
Before we end the episode, as progressives, what should our hope be in these Brexit negotiations?
Again, another tough question. There is a dark side and a light side in this. I think the dark side is that the UK, particularly England, is heading towards a conservative philosophy that progressives will find very difficult to agree with. This is one that sees the UK becoming isolationist, one that takes on kind of a Britain first mentality and attitude, one that seems to kind of advocate for superiority of the UK. There tends to be, and this might deserve at least a live stream or another episode in itself. There seems to be a conservative philosophical alignment happening between the US, the UK, and even Russia. In fact, particularly between Russia and the US, actually, is that you've got an America first attitude, you have a common religion that unites everyone, and you have a foundation of legislation that's based on a moral ethic code. And I think these three issues of conservatism are beginning to embed itself in the UK as well. So I do think you'll actually begin to see an alignment of philosophy and then ultimately policy, and that worries me a little bit, because if the UK is continuing to head down that conservative track, then we are talking about potential threats to things like treating other people with dignity and respect. We are talking about isolationism. We are talking about ideas of aggressive foreign policy again. On the lighter side, I think the European Union still holds progressive values quite close to the chest. They are globalists, they are tolerant, they desire diplomacy over supremacy. I think as you begin to see the further alignment of European values and the continued unity of the EU27, I think it'll actually be the European Union, and whoever the major players are in the European Union, they will be the leaders of the free world. Trump is not the leader of the free world. I've said that before. I very much like the idea that it's not Trump anymore. The US president is no longer the leader of the free world. It will be, I think, the leader of the European Union as it comes about. And actually the European Union is beginning to become more progressive in itself. It looks like the next president of France will be a progressive. The progressives in Germany are pushing for a major, perhaps not a win necessarily, but at least a big gain in influence within the German political system. So I think we'll be looking to the EU in future for our cues regarding kind of a progressive model that we would want to follow.
As much as it scares me, I'd probably have to agree with you there. Adam. And as an American, sort of seeing the rabid conservatism inside of our country ceding that role as such a prominent global leader is sad to say the least. And I think it's a culmination, unfortunately, of progressives just failing to do their job inside the country. And hopefully, my hope is that this sort of awakening of the conservative ethic, not even this conservative ethic, because I don't want to demonize conservatives, but this extremism on the conservative side is doing so much damage. But hopefully, the response to it, like you're seeing through Bernie Sanders and other progressives around the country, hopefully it'll awaken a progressive response and sort of change the tides on these things. But again, that remains to be seen. So there it is, our Brexit special. We hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to subscribe on iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter at CommonersPod. And we actually have been uploading our episodes to YouTube. So you can subscribe there as well for those episodes and any live streams that we do in the future.
Don't forget to catch Political Animals in your feed every Friday morning. And we also have another special coming up next in the Commoners podcast. 2 weeks from now, on the 17th of April, will be our French election special. So, John, this has been a Europe-heavy couple of months for you. You've got a lot of research to do. It's certainly been an exciting run-up to the French election, so I'm looking forward to chatting to you about it.
Also, I would add that within the next couple of weeks, we'd like to do a live stream. We've been kicking around a few topics. One of particular interest, given me and Adam's differences on religion, is whether or not there is such a thing as absolute morality, and if so, does that necessitate a God, and what role that sort of morality should play in politics. Also, as a final note here, we are looking to grow Commoners Podcast. We are looking to improve Commoners Podcast. So, our loyal listeners, we're asking you to send us any feedback you might have on maybe even topics, ways that we could improve the podcast. What would make you want to listen even more? If you have any feedback like that, please feel free to drop it in our inbox, commonerspodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, as always, stay informed.
But believe it or not, pig semen still has to be negotiated. So imagine being on that committee.
David Cameron probably would sign up for that.
Oh, dear. Yep.